Jeffrey Epstein. Since then, a tidal wave of scandals.
Jeffrey Epstein escaped child sex charges 10 years ago in a federal plea deal so remarkable, the Palm Beach police chief who investigated the case said it was unprecedented.
We believed he would spend the rest of his life in prison.
Innuendo.
There are code words that suggest Jeffrey Epstein and his associates could maybe even be engaging in some sort of consumption. Is that human consumption? There's a lot of talk of beef jerky. There's a restaurant called The Cannibal.
Atrocities. Lawsuits.
The first time that Courtney Wild walked into my office in 2008 and said, look, the government's not paying attention to me. She was not asking for money from Jeffrey Epstein. And I walked it in and I handed the pleading in. Courtney Wild was right outside, ready at the time. She told me this is an emergency. And I told the clerk, I want a hearing. And she said, when? I said, now.
Trials.
Ghislaine Maxwell sat in her chair with little emotion, only pouring herself a glass of water as the judge read the verdict, guilty on all but one count.
And suspicious deaths has ensued.
So Epstein's taken off suicide watch. The day before he kills himself, his roommate is removed from the cell. The cameras on his tier are not working. The guards fell asleep. It seems almost impossible to think all of those things could happen in that way.
It does.
The public demand for transparency and accountability was insatiable.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein?
Shut up. I know he's your friend, but I don't care.
Culminating in the release of the Epstein files.
When will we see justice? I've not seen any arrests from the revelations in the Epstein files.
Do you think you're the devil himself? No, but I do have a good mirror.
This is the story they tell.
Well, I don't think there's a more essential issue than the issue of climate change.
The future of the auto industry is electric. There's no turning back.
This is a preview of things to come.
More Americans could soon get the chance to drive a vehicle made in China.
The new vehicles that we're making at Ford are data collection machines. They're like mobile drones.
We're going to be noisy. We're going to be disruptive. We're going to be unignorable. We're going to be a pain in the ass until you listen to us.
The first factor, easily discerned by anybody who has their eyes open, that compromises and erodes the hopeless existential view of the world that we're getting from science, is the idea that nature is in fact, across all scales and all levels of phenomena, a unity. It's not a coincidence that electrons spinning around an atomic nucleus and planets going around a star and star clusters orbiting around the gravitational center of a galaxy. It's no coincidence that these systems exhibit the same kind of order on different scales. And yet science would say that is a coincidence. You know, P.W. Bridgman, who was a philosopher of science, defined a coincidence as what you have left over when you apply a bad theory.
Bounce, brain. truth is not a given.
Vaccine. GMOs.
Jeffrey Epstein.
UFOs.
Splashed. Mark bearing and range.
There are those who want the truth suppressed, sequestered, and exploited. Then there are those who want the truth revealed, disseminated, and uncensored. You are one of those people.
Chester Bennington. He was 41 years old and the artist was found dead.
I see the need for action. I see the need for a great reset.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society.
Hundreds of abusive clergy.
It was unidentified, and that's why it was so unsettling.
You deserve the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are watching Dauntless Live.
Welcome to Dauntless Live. I am your host, Adam Riva. I'm so excited to be joining you on this special Sunday broadcast. Today is May 24th, 2026. We have an incredible show in store for you today. We have a lot of information to get through, so pardon me if I speak quickly in this episode. I want to touch on everything. But first, let's head over to our website, and I'm going to show you guys what we're all about. So check it out. DauntlessDialogue.com. We are a media house. We produce original docuseries, animated series, short films, long-form documentaries. We produce lots of cool stuff for you to learn about corruption and evil and good stuff that's been suppressed from you. All sorts of cool stuff. We just like to investigate interesting subjects, and we hope that you find the subjects that we pick to be fascinating. We have recently launched this new website, and I think it's just such an improvement from where we were a few short months ago. We have these new analytic-driven carousels, for instance, top 10 most loved on Dauntless. So this is actually generated from you, the viewers. Members specifically can vote on things that they love the most, and our app aggregates all of that and delivers it. If you click on popular, you'll actually find a ton of other analytic-driven carousels and hero sections, stuff that's trending. We try to make it, oh, hey, look, who's that guy? That ugly fruitcake. Oh, that was me. Whoops. We have trending today. We've got, oh, by the way, we are now, this is going to get meta for a second, but if you click watch here on the Dauntless Live button, it should hopefully, look at that. I feel like I'm in a Bo Burnham special. Look at this. Okay, so I should have mentioned we are simulcasting on BitChute, Rumble, X, and YouTube. That's right, we're back on YouTube. So you can find the link in the description. This is our third or fourth time. I've actually lost count, but we're trying it again, and we're trying to make it easy for you to find us and follow us. If you want to support us, click on the subscribe button in the top right of our website. And we have 3 options for you. You have a basic plan, a value plan. This gets you 1 year's access, and a gold pass, which is lifetime access. I just want to make an announcement too, in case anyone hadn't seen the email. If you are a gold pass member, I recently contacted you. We're trying to set up a private live stream with me where you get to interact with me. And for this first one, it's just going to be me. But for upcoming, gold pass calls, we're going to get some of the other Dauntless team on board so that you can interact with your favorite filmmakers. And I think that's just an additional little perk to being a gold pass member. So if you want, you can give that some consideration. And of course, we value you no matter what your subscription status is. We love all of you so darn much. I want to apologize for last week, by the way. The audio glitches and snafus were rather embarrassing. I think I'm getting better at this live streaming thing, though. I've got so many bells and whistles here. If only you could see how many dials and levers I'm controlling, particularly when you simulcast. It's a lot to keep track of. It's a lot of preparation, but I'm happy to do it. I love you guys so much, and I'm honored to spend this time with you. I think that's it. Check out the Crystal Veil series trailer that we just posted. We actually premiered it on last week's show, and it's almost done. We are so close to publishing the first installment. And so if you're a Dauntless member, you have that to look forward to. Okay, where do we begin? Do you guys detect that? Do you guys smell that? I think that's the smell of industry funding. The world of nutrition is already complex enough. And as we spoke about in our not last live stream, but the last one that I did solo, called How to Find Truthful Nutrition Information, I did my best to provide for you a bevy of resources and tips to navigate this very complex and confusing world so that you can make more informed choices for your health and the health of your family. And unfortunately, there is this corrupting force. I would describe it as the most powerful corrupting force in nutrition, outside of the scope of, just people who are weighing in, believing themselves to have all the answers when they've been looking into this stuff for a very short period of time, and they want to broadcast their excitement to the world, and they lead people astray. Aside from just that sort of organic grassroots misinformation that's out there, there is deliberate disinformation. And you all know this. This is not a secret. The problem is that we'd prefer it doesn't exist, and we'd rather just sort of not pay it any mind. But I think that it's so important to talk about it. We're going to do a college course on it right here, on how to understand and identify and be on the lookout for industry funding, whether that's coming from the agricultural industry or food companies. And those two together represent monolithic titanic forces that can really shape public perceptions, federal nutrition policies, and just, funding vast amounts of research that is just junky, just junk, like the junk food coming out of the ultra processed food industry. It's ultra processed junk science. All right. So we will be going through so many different things today. And like I said, we have a lot of information to get to. Buckle up. First, we're going to talk about how nutrition science is even funded, and which funding sources are the most reliable, and why nutrition researchers even accept corporate funding in the first place. We're going to talk about the difference between marketing research and scientific research. We're going to talk about how, beginning in the 1980s and really becoming more pronounced and commonplace in the 2010s is the push for all these different nutrition journals to require disclosure of conflicts of interest from study authors, and how there's no legal penalty if you fail to do so. We're going to talk about how common agricultural and corporate funding is in nutrition research. We will be talking about the myriad ways that big ag and food companies influence nutritional research and public perception of dietary trends. We're going to dig into the playbook tactics that are used to promote products like high fructose corn syrup, sucrose, milk, red meat, and soda, among other items, that really mirrors tactics that we see from big pharma and big tobacco to a T. And we're going to get very specific. We're going to name names. I'm going to show you an abundance of examples. And so by the end of this presentation, believe me, I don't think that you're going to be doubting any of this. We're going to talk about RFK Jr. once again. Just can't stop talking about the guy. We did a show a month ago called Massive Maha Failures or something like that. And we're going to be talking about industry influence and conflicts of interest in the current administration and how it's worse than ever. We will be examining the 2025 to 2030 U.S. food-based dietary guidelines. We're going to look at the manipulative word games used by the food industry. We're also going to look at duplicitous front groups and public relations war rooms, as well as some examples of high-profile corporate shills or, just tactless promoters of this stuff. When you pull back the curtain and you see the ties, you can't unsee it. And of course, they're just sort of polluting the world of nutrition. Big agriculture's massive mandatory checkoff programs and the billions in government subsidies to prop up certain food groups over others. And we're also going to wrap up with resources and tips for identifying corporate influence so that you feel empowered by the end of this. If you enjoy these sorts of presentations that I'm doing, please smash that like button. Show me some love. Share this presentation with your friends and family. I think that this information is critical. And I'm going to show a lot of receipts today. So we're not just going to be pontificating here, speculating. We're going to be actually putting our finger on the evidence and showing it so it's preserved for all time. So let's dive in. Let's begin again, as I said, with how nutrition research is even funded. I have to say this because I think that there's a misunderstanding out there. First of all, why is there a necessity for all this money? Well, it's because science costs a lot of money. In fact, randomized control trials, which are just one branch of, one type of study design, and clinical research is really one aspect of, it's one of the four main pillars of nutrition research, but it's often the most costly because it's the most intensive, it's experimental, and depending on that experiment, that intervention, you have to either bring people to you or you go to them. You have to monitor them around the clock in some cases or regularly, and those check-ins and all of the biomarkers and everything, it's expensive to do. And oftentimes meals are provided for interventional trials. And so the NIH funded nutrition grants on average are $400,000. Randomized control trials typically range anywhere from $100,000 all the way up to $1 to $2 million. And then you have some much, much larger ones, which are not, not common, but the Women's Health Initiative Dietary Modification Trial, which is ongoing, which has tens of thousands of participants, has already raked up cost $586 million, over $500 million. So there are people, private donors, who fund these sorts of things, and foundations often get involved, nonprofit foundations. Government grants are a big part of nutrition research. And as we've mentioned, corporations or industry-backed, industry backing. So those are really the 3 or 4 primary sources of funding for nutrition research. So just again, to recap, it's government, it's nonprofit foundations, it's corporations, and private donors. That's the majority of it. And as far as reliability goes, you can imagine, well, actually, it might surprise you, but government-sponsored and foundation-sponsored science is often the most trustworthy, particularly in comparison to industry-funded. When you get the food industry involved, there's a profit incentive. There's a reason that they're doing that research. There's a reason. It's an investment, if you will. And with NIH-sponsored stuff, there are so many careful, steps and strictures on how things are conducted that it's far more reliable than I think you would imagine. As far as the prevalence, okay. Oh, wait, not prevalence yet. Okay, so in PLOS Medicine in 2007, there was a study published called Relationship Between Funding Source and Conclusion Among Nutrition-Related Scientific Articles by Lesser et al. I believe I have this one here. And it looked at 206 studies that examined the benefits of milk, soda, and fruit, or fruit juices, and it determined that those funded entirely by a food or beverage company were 4 to 8 times more likely to find positive health effects from consuming the sponsor's products or the products in question. Right? Big surprise. I'm not surprised. You're not surprised. And not only is industry funding, not only are industry funded studies 4 to 8 times more likely to find evidence that would be beneficial to its sponsors, the study designs are just garbage. And we're going to get into the specifics of that in just a moment. Now, again, we asked the question, why would scientists why would they entertain accepting corporate money? Especially when it is so stigmatized, especially when it could ruin their career in some cases, if, depending on the study and depending on, the implications, if that sort of thing got around, well, that could be a blemish on their, professional career. So why would they even entertain taking money? Well, we pointed out that these trials are very expensive and they're probably not going to happen or not to the degree and not to the size and scale without this sort of money. But also, scientists believe that they can do good in the world if they maintain proper boundaries with their sponsors. So I don't want to just say, look, every time that there's going to be some industry connection, does that immediately make the scientist who's involved, have corrupt motives and the findings are garbage? No. As we pointed out, it's about 4 to 8 times more likely to find results that are beneficial to the sponsor, but not in every instance. And a lot of scientists, they'll make agreements, they'll make certain concessions, but they say, look, we're gonna publish the results no matter what. Even if if they cast your products in a negative light, we must publish. These are the sorts of reasons why a lot of scientists will go through with it. And if they're the ones who are designing the study, and as I mentioned, if they can keep the sponsor outside of healthy boundaries, then, the world could benefit from some of that science. There's not enough good science happening. And so as long as the scientists can maintain that professionalism, and it doesn't always work out, of course, then that's why a lot of them decide to go through with it and accept the money. Now, when it comes to the difference between marketing research and scientific research, I'm going to read to you a definition here, and immediately you'll go, oh yeah, of course. Marketing research is the systematic gathering, recording, and analysis of qualitative and quantitative data about issues relating to marketing products and services. The goal is to identify and assess how changing elements of the marketing mix impacts customer behavior. This involves employing a data-driven marketing approach to specify the data required to address these issues, then designing a method for collecting the information and implementing the data collection process. So marketing research has a foregone conclusion before they even set up the experiment or the study, as opposed to basic science, which sets out to test a hypothesis and has not already come to some sort of conclusion. And then, of course, so you have marketing research, you have scientific research, and then you have lobbying. And this is like, we're going to get into lobbying towards the end of today's discussion. But, pretty much every industry has companies where they fund studies. And it's just completely widespread. It's happening all the time, every industry. Particularly if you're a company that has a product that's unhealthy, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to sort of come up with a plan to frame your products in a better light by designing a study that makes it seem like it's not that unhealthy. That's in every unhealthy company, in every product that's unhealthy, the companies have that motivation. It's a given. As I mentioned at the beginning, disclosure of these conflicts of interest began to be pushed for in the 1980s, and in the 90s and in the noughts, there was a growing demand for this, and more journals were setting that standard. And then really by the 2010s, this became very commonplace. It became the new standard. However, frustratingly, there's no penalty, no law requiring you to do so. So if you don't declare conflicts of interest, it's just up to, watchdog groups and the consumer to look out for that. And if they catch you, maybe they can tar and feather you publicly, but that's about it. There's no jail time, there's no fine, there's nothing. And so again, it's just like, if no one's looking, maybe they will try to get away with it. More to the point about how common agricultural industry and food industry influence is in nutrition science, it's just not a very well understood subject. And the reason is we have paltry data to draw any substantive conclusions. We just have a handful of studies that have looked at this, done these sort of systematic reviews. Probably the best study that's been done was in 2020 by Gary Sachs et al., who analyzed all peer-reviewed articles from the 10 leading nutrition-related journals in 2018 and found that 13.4% disclosed food industry involvement. Sort of begs the question, what if some of those studies, what if the authors did not disclose? So it's at least 13.4, possibly higher. By August of 2018, there had only been 11 published studies on the effects of food industry influence on nutrition science. There have been others since then, but again, it's just not very well researched. In 2016, Lisa Barrow and Associates performed a meta-analysis to determine food industry influence in nutrition research. They included every study they could find. 775 studies were what they initially started with, but according to them, only 12 met their criteria for inclusion. And so it was a pretty small, sample. They found that although industry funding was more likely to result in favorable findings, it was not statistically significant and could be due to chance. Again, they just analyzed 12 studies for that. Let's talk about the myriad ways that big food and, big agriculture influence nutrition and public perception specifically. So there are playbook tactics that are as old as the sun. They've been used for the better part of a century, particularly by big tobacco and big pharma. And unfortunately, when it comes to the food industry, there's less oversight. That might change, but the chips are stacked against us, or the cards are stacked against us. So let's look, for instance, at the sugar industry's tactics for undermining public perception and policy. The sugar industry is one of the most aggressive. They have, and this has come out in emails from within the industry, attack the science, spread misinformation, deploy industry scientists, and influence academics. Above all else, cast doubt. Food industry influence on nutrition seems to mirror pharmaceutical drug influence. And we have a lot of research on that. But as we said, there's less certainty and less research done on nutrition with respect to the food industry. There's also the issue of food companies funding nutrition societies. Again, are they going to be honest about that? Research can introduce biases in the study design, in the study methods, in the research conduct, and in the research reporting. So if you think of it as a chain, there are multiple links, and any one or any number of them can fail. This does not have to be deliberate. Biases can be unconscious, unintentional, and unrecognized. The majority of bias in the food industry funded research is not in the quality of the science per se, but in the questions asked from the onset. So if you set out with one of these foregone conclusions and you ask the right, aka the wrong questions, you can do very diligent research, very proper science on those questions, and you're going to, it's like when you leave port on a ship, if you point your ship 1 degree off, well, you're not going to arrive at your destination. Food companies can downplay positive or negative results. They can focus. Okay, so this is, I should have led with this. These are some of the ways that they can sort of, squirt ink in the water and confuse or distract and play fast and loose with the results of the findings. So they can downplay positive results or negative results depending on what they're looking at. They could downplay positive results of the competition or of something that's put in contrast with their own product or their own goals. They can downplay the negative findings on their own target. They can focus on the obvious. So it's like they can just talk about what everybody already understands. It's like, saying a whole lot of nothing, and in doing so, you're like lulled into a hypnotic trance where you forget the actual reason you're reading it. Like, it's just like, if somebody's telling you a lie, they're going to talk about all this other stuff. They're going to focus on the obvious, and you find yourself agreeing. It's like, yeah, because it's the obvious stuff. They can focus on the irrelevant and gaslight you. They can exaggerate subtleties, right? Play up little details that don't matter. They can ignore nuance. They can introduce confusing language, scientific jargon, whatnot. Or, in probably the most duplicitous way, they can just avoid publishing altogether. If they don't like the findings of the study, guess what? Sometimes that happens. They don't publish at all. There was a meta-analysis that I should mention, the mother of all of this sort of food industry influence in nutrition, her name is Marianne Nestle. She's awesome. Her name is spelled like Nestle, but not said the same, no relation whatsoever. Marianne Nestle has authored, I think, like 17 books at this point. And she truly is the preeminent, world authority, I'd say, on this subject. And we're going to go through some book recommendations at the end of today's talk. But in her book, Unsavory Truth, How Food Companies Skew the Science of the Food We Eat, or of what we eat, she talks about a meta-analysis that was done by someone with industry ties, and they found that food industry funded studies were actually higher in quality. Of course, right? The high fructose corn syrup industry has been caught paying scientists $41,000 a month, in one example, on retainer to combat stories that high fructose corn syrup might be riskier than sugar, and to write editorial hit pieces. So industry influence is not just limited to the study itself. It, of course, spills over into commentary, editorials, commercials, books, so on and so forth. We'll get into many examples. Zero of the interventional studies on milk with full industry support reached unfavorable conclusions. And this bias exceeds even that seen in pharmaceutical research and applies similarly to soda industry funding like Coca-Cola. So it's like 100% of the industry funded studies from the milk industry all found beneficial results. Oh, wow. Amazing how that happens, right? All right. Okay, guys. I think it's time to get into some of the more controversial subject matters for today. I should mention we did massive MAHA failures a few weeks back, and I would say that's supplemental viewing to this discussion because we will be extrapolating on some of the foundations that we laid in that episode. And so I'm going to try my best to not repeat any of that, but there is overlap, of course. And so we're going to be talking now about food-based dietary guidelines, at least in the American context. I think this is where a lot of the rubber meets the road. Not that everyone listens to the national dietary guidelines. Most people don't even know what they advocate for or recommend. However, it does affect school lunch programs, military lunch programs, and all federal program food menu options. And so it does affect a large percentage of the country. The food industry is going to do everything it can to meddle with the Dietary Advisory Committee and the food-based dietary guidelines. In a previous episode, I did, I think, a thorough job of explaining that it's not the Dietary Advisory Committee, which convenes every 5 years, that is the weak point. In fact, it's rather bulletproof the way that it's set up. That might shock you if this is the first time you're hearing it. I think most Americans who have doubt or skepticism probably would pinpoint the Dietary Advisory Committee as just being the easiest vector of influence for the food industry and big agriculture. That's not the case. Trust me, when you look into it, you will find that it's tremendously rigorous with so many checks and balances. And when I looked into it, I was very impressed. So generally it's like 20 nutrition scientists. You have to declare if there are conflicts of interest. Generally, they will recuse themselves from participation. But every single point is debated thoroughly and does not advance until there's this overwhelming consensus. And so any one person can rebut against the entire group. So it moves very slowly. It's probably extremely tedious. There's so much debate over nuance. And so there's really only recommendations made or conclusions made when there is no shadow of a doubt. And that is really cool. I mean, the 20 participants are also, in most cases, they're nutrition scientists. And these are people who are respected amongst their peers. They volunteer for the job. It's unpaid by law. It takes 2 years, and I think it's 10 hours a week. So it's a lot of investment for really no thanks, and a ton of criticism, a ton of flack. These people do it because I think they understand that it's a noble duty for those who can and are able and willing to influence what Americans are told as far as dietary guidelines. It's a tremendously noble thing. Now, the weak point then actually is once they turn over their recommendations in the form of their report, the secretaries of the HHS and the USDA can make countervailing, arbitrary decisions that supersede the entire council. They can arbitrarily reject anything that they want to reject. And then those two people are really the bottleneck whereby that entire report that took 2 years, every single word had to be agreed on by consensus. They can just throw it out. And we've talked about the loyalties and the conflicts of interest for RFK Jr. and Brooke Rollins. I don't have a high opinion of them. I'm phenomenally thankful for the rescheduling of vaccines, of course. Give credit where it's due. There are good things happening. Not everything is tragic. But with respect to the conflicts of interest that RFK Jr. swore he would eliminate, it's a joke. You are being lied to. I don't know how else to say it. I'm saying it with as straight a face as I can. I will provide overwhelming evidence for these claims, just so you're aware. Stay tuned. You are being lied to by RFK Jr. You are being lied to by Brooke Rollins. Now, I'm not here to say that they're bad people. I think that they are coming to this with their own biases. And those biases are like them leaving their front door open for intruders. In this case, industry influence. If you're biased and you hold that position and you have no nutritional background at all, which neither RFK Jr. or Brooke Rollins have. In fact, Brooke Rollins has a career going to bat for Big Ag. And RFK Jr. has been, advocating his own diet, which does not align with the recommendations from the U.S. Dietary Advisory Committee and, global consensus on some of these dietary, nutrients. And so let's get into it. You're being lied to. And that's the sad fact. I wish it wasn't the case. I wish I didn't have to sit here and tell you that there is a lot of this shenanigans going on. So let's tiptoe into this. First, we have here, published in BMJ, U.S. Dietary Committee is plagued with high-risk conflicts of interest, report finds. 9 out of 20 of the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee have high or medium risk conflicts of interest with companies or industry groups that have a stake in the outcome of the guidelines, a report has claimed. The group U.S. Right to Know, which campaigns for transparency in the food industry, looked at each committee members' ties with food, pharmaceutical, or weight loss companies or industry groups over the past 5 years using publicly available data. It found that, an additional 4 members had possible conflicts. Let's now look at this. We have a statement from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics on the release of the dietary guidelines for Americans for 2025 to 2030. And they raise concerns. They say, while many recommendations align with long-standing nutrition science, other elements raise significant concerns. What the Academy supports. Encouraging let me enlarge that for you guys. Encouraging nutrient-dense foods, including fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Recommendations to limit highly processed foods and added sugars. Of course, we're all on board with that. Maintaining a limit of no more than 10% of total calories from saturated fat, while prioritizing healthier fats. And of course, RFK Jr. goes, the war against saturated fat is over, meaning they win and they're saying, all this other science against saturated fat being, implicated as a causal factor in, the progression of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, for instance, or diabetes is unfounded, according to them. The Academy also supports increased attention to fiber and microbiome health. Of course, fiber is critical. We did an entire show on how to optimize the microbiome with food and not probiotics. And it all comes down to fiber, which 98 to 99% of Americans are deficient in. And I would even go so far as to say the official, RDA for fiber is still very low compared to what our ancient ancestors ate. So the average American gets something like 16 grams of fiber a day when our ancient ancestors were getting over 100 a day. So, a carnivore diet would have 0 fiber. Now, where the Academy has concerns, saturated fat, the emphasis on butter, beef tallow, red meat, and full-fat dairy is inconsistent with the recommendation of limiting saturated fat to 10% of total calories. Evidence shows that these foods are high in saturated fat, increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Dairy. The new guidelines do not consider individuals who cannot or choose not to consume dairy products, for instance, those who are lactose intolerant, which is like all of the Black community and many more. Low-calorie, non-nutritive sweeteners. The guidelines emphasize moderation, even though evidence to date indicates they are generally considered safe within acceptable intake limits. And synthetic food dyes. Consistent with the Academy's nutrition fact check, research suggests a small subset of children may be sensitive to synthetic food dyes. However, findings are inconsistent and additional research is needed. So they're just basically saying, look, it's reasonable, but we don't have the science yet on synthetic food dyes. And you can understand why. So let's now look at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. Says new dietary guidelines undercut science and sow confusion. It says this level of contradiction is unacceptable given the secretaries had clear, transparent evidence-based recommendations at their disposal. The 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, finalized in December 2024. However, the secretaries dismissed this 2-year scientific review led by 20 independent nutrition experts in collaboration with federal scientists and informed by thousands of public comments and 7 public meetings, all because it incorporated health equity and, they allege, ideological bias, institutional conflicts, or predetermined conclusions. That is flat out projection. Give me a break. In an unprecedented move, the secretaries sought out a separate group of nutrition scientists, many with ties to the meat and dairy industries, evading public and transparent processes to create a new scientific report that props up the meat and dairy industries at the expense of human and environmental health and undermines established processes for setting recommended daily allowances for nutrients, like protein, in service of Secretary Kennedy's predetermined beliefs. Overall, the new Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee completely rejects more than half of the Dietary Advisory Committee. Okay, so the new Dietary Guideline, what is DGA? What are these? Dietary Guidelines for Americans completely rejects more than half of the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee's recommendations as outlined by the department's own scientific justification document released today. Yeah. And then it goes on to say, it's been endorsed by more than 20 organizations in health, nutrition, environment, education, and food system fields, including the National Education Association, the National WIC Association, and the Society for Nutrition Education and Behavior. They are also endorsed by 13 individual members of the previous Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committees, including 7 members of the 2025 Advisory Committee. Then you have this, the petition for investigation and administrative action submitted by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, Dr. Neil Barnard's association. I'm just going to read a little bit here. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services have failed to carry out their mandatory duties in developing the 2025 to 2030 edition of the Dietary Guidelines. Significant conflicts of interest among the authors of the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines, the report upon which the guidelines are based, have resulted in nutrition recommendations that favor the economic interests of unhealthful food industry associations over the health interests of the general public and put the public at increased risk for cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and birth defects. And they're calling for immediate action on this. They then go through, of the 9 authors of the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines, upon which the guidelines are based, 8 had conflicts of interest. I don't know if you remember, in a previous episode, I had said 6 out of 9. And I was wrong. It's 8 out of 9. Just to clarify, RFK Jr. and Brooke Rollins rejected the more than half of the comprehensive report that was put together by the nutrition scientists, because RFK Jr., in all his omniscient wisdom, bias, decided that he knew better and he was going to assemble his own committee, his own advisory committee, which had 8 out of 9 people with conflicts of interest. Ty Beal, PhD, a scientific advisory committee member for the Food and Agricultural Project, comprehensive and evidence-based global assessment of the contribution of livestock to food security, sustainable food systems, nutrition, and healthy diets. Okay, let's just accelerate this. Whey, egg whites, hydrolyzed grass-fed collagen, keto products, milk protein, dairy platform, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, North Dakota Beef Council, Texas Beef Council, General Mills, American Dairy Science Association, infant formula, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Dairy Council, American Egg Board. Are you starting to see a pattern? If not, let me keep going. National Cattlemen's Beef Association again, Egg Nutrition Center, National Pork Board, General Mills, California Dairy and Dairy Management, Simply Good Foods, National Dairy Council. I don't care what you, the listener, eats, but let's agree that this is the opposite of what he said he was going to do, getting corporate funding out. Anyone who supports the new dietary guidelines must admit that it is based on the recommendations of first of all, a deviation from how these dietary guidelines have always been adjudicated, determined. A completely unprecedented anomaly here. A subversion of the sort of process. And this is embarrassing. This is shameful. This is disgusting. Even if you agree with, like, when I say agree, it's like, even if your diet agrees with what RFK Jr. put out, even if you agree, you have to admit that this is filthy. This is a joke. We have here from the American Heart Association. New dietary guidelines underscore the importance of healthy eating. Yes. Okay. American Heart Association. Okay. Let's get into it here. We are concerned that recommendations regarding salt, seasoning, and red meat consumption could inadvertently lead consumers to exceed recommended limits for sodium and saturated fats, which are primary drivers of cardiovascular disease. While the guidelines highlight whole fat dairy, the Heart Association encourages consumption of low fat and fat-free dairy products, which can be beneficial to heart health. For decades, the Heart Association has issued science-based recommendations for healthy eating. We remain committed to working with the administration to reduce the burden of chronic disease, particularly in the next generation, and to help consumers make healthier choices for themselves and their families. This includes promoting healthy dietary patterns that significantly reduce consumption of added sugars and sodium. Protein is an essential component of a healthy diet, and we urge more scientific research on both the appropriate amount of protein consumption and the best protein sources for optimal health. Pending that research, we encourage consumers to prioritize plant-based proteins, seafood, and lean meats, low in saturated fat, and to limit high-fat animal products, including red meat, butter, lard, and tallow, which are linked to increased cardiovascular risk. Tallow is like, RFK Jr.'s pet project. And if you're interested, you can go here to it's dietaryguidelines.gov/2025-advisory-committee-report. And you will find all of everything that went into the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's report. And so for anyone who's interested in further reading, we have here an article that says, this is when they first released the new inverted dietary guidelines. New dietary guidelines urge Americans to avoid processed foods and added sugar. Yes, that's fine. We all agree. What the heck? I had a section highlighted. The guidelines made a few other notable changes, including a call to potentially double protein consumption. We talked about this in our episode, Stop Obsessing About Protein. The RDA for protein is set at 2 standard deviations above baseline. And so that means that something like 97 to 98% of the entire US population is covered. The only extreme outliers of, physical athletes, they would require more, but 98% of people are getting more than they need with the RDAs. And then RFK Jr. comes in and he's like, no, actually, we're not getting enough protein, even though we're one of the top consumers of protein in the world. We're one of the top consumers of meat in the world. I believe we are the top consumer of animal-based proteins per capita. But he says we're clearly not getting enough. I don't know how other countries and other populations are surviving and in many cases thriving beyond the American health span and lifespan. Here we go. The new guidelines largely rejected the advice of a 20-member panel of nutrition experts convened by the Biden administration. That does not mean that they're some leftist ideologues. It just happened under the Biden administration in 2023 because it's a 2-year process. These are apolitical nutrition scientists. That's not their politics is not their thing. Kennedy had criticized the expertise of the panel. Oh my God. It's like nails on a chalkboard. It's so cringy. Kennedy had criticized the expertise of the panel members and suggested that they had ties to the food industry. Instead, the new guidance relied on a new set of experts revealed Wednesday in supporting documents. Of the 10 experts who led the scientific review under Kennedy, 5 reported financial ties to beef, pork, or dairy. And we already went through that. It's actually 8 out of 9 for industry funding. So let's just real quickly, if you want to see the actual dietary recommendations, let's look at them now. This is realfood.gov. And here you're going to find, everything that has now been recommended under RFK and Brooke Rollins. So I want you to just put on, just as like a thought experiment, follow me if you will. We're going to do a little experiment. Just put on your skeptical goggles. Regardless of if you support RFK, if you're excited about the vaccine, rescheduling, all of the other stuff, put it aside for just the time being. Just go in with skeptical goggles that I know my audience uses with everything else. You guys are smart cookies, all right? You guys look for propaganda in your day-to-day lives. Let's apply that same practice here and now. Real food wins. Yay, real food. We're all about real food. We're done with ultra-processed food. We can all agree on that. America is the greatest country on earth and the sickest. Highly processed food has hollowed out our health, driving obesity, diabetes, heart disease. Yes, we all agree. We're all on the same page. However, that's not the majority of what has been, focusing on whole foods is not the only and not the largest changes that they made. 50% of Americans have prediabetes or diabetes. 75% of adults report having at least one chronic condition. 90% of U.S. healthcare spending goes to treating chronic disease. Yes, America is obviously sick. Now, how many people follow the recommendations of the American Heart Association, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, the American Dietetic Association, all like in a previous episode, the 2 weeks ago, we went through how to find truthful nutrition information. We looked at the consensus from around the world to eat a predominantly plant-based diet and how many people in America are doing that. The actual vegan population in America is 1% to 2%. and very few vegetarians for that matter. So it's not that we're eating too many plants here. That's not the issue. It's not because 1 to 2% of people are avoiding saturated fat, but we need more saturated fat. Okay. So they show this 1992 food pyramid. For decades, we've been misled by guidance that prioritize highly processed foods. Now, keep in mind their wording here. They keep talking about whole foods, real foods, and avoiding processed foods. Keep that in mind. For the first time, wow, official U.S. guidelines call on Americans to avoid highly processed food. This is not an attack on industry or legal definition. It reflects a public health. Okay. Boom. That's the inverted food pyramid, literally inverted. And of course, it wasn't a food pyramid immediately preceding this. That was manipulative, what they just did. We aren't coming directly from a food pyramid. We're coming from the My Plate, which has been in practice for decades. The My Plate is very different than the way that they laid this out. So this is appealing, in my opinion, to everyone who thinks of and conceives the food pyramid. They're literally turning that symbol upside down because their rhetoric is, we're going to totally change everything. We're now for the first time doing real food, and we're going to invert that. And okay, let's see here. The first things, so in America, we read from left to right. So anything you put on the left is intentional. The first things you see are steak, cheese, turkey, ground beef, red meat. Okay, fish, milk, yogurt, canned fish, probably tuna, very high in heavy metals, very high in mercury, arsenic, lead. Eggs, okay, one of the highest sources of saturated fat, one of the highest sources of dietary cholesterol. Shrimp, and then down here towards the bottom, walnuts, almonds, rice and beans, the things that are eaten all around the world by populations that outlive us. Nuts, bananas. Okay, so now on the right side, again, what you see secondarily after you see all the animal products. Okay, broccoli, carrots, tomatoes, pears, lettuce, blueberries, strawberries. Okay, down here at the bottom, you've got bread, right? A processed carb, okay, refined carb. Oatmeal and whole grains. Wait a minute, I thought we were interested in eating real food. So they're emphasizing saturated fat, dairy. Dairy, dude, dairy. Dairy's literally the second word. Dairy. And what they call healthy fats, right? Protein, emphasizing animal-based proteins, right? These things here are not high in protein. Well, peas are, beans, fine. The majority of this stuff is not high in protein. This is what they're telling you to eat for protein. And rice and beans and oats and grain, not just oats, whole grains, right? Quinoa, barley, kamut, rice, wheat, go on and on. That stuff is all at the bottom, the very, 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 very bottom. Oh my God, I guess I'm going to probably die soon based on how much I eat. Okay. I got to pick up the pace here. So we're going to go through this quickly. All right. So they provide for you, all their press releases and everything. You're more than welcome to get into that. They also have the AI thing. I'd be very cautious with that. That's probably going to be trained on their own industry-funded science here. And so, they call out a lot of things here that are mutually agreeable. They're trying to make non-provocative, non-divisive pronouncements. Removing soda and candy from SNAP. Awesome. Ensuring schools and military bases serve real food. What does that mean? That's just blank, empty platitude rhetoric. Improving infant formula. Awesome. Getting rid of, petroleum-based dyes. Fine. Awesome. Not a priority. Should we not consume it? Of course not. Not a priority. It's not giving people heart disease. It's not giving, the vast majority of the population diabetes, atherosclerosis, Alzheimer's, cancer. This is not a priority. Let's get it out. Definitely. Don't get me wrong. I haven't touched artificial dyes in over 20 years. But again, non-divisive statements. Overhauling the FDA's GRAS, generally recognized as safe. Fine. Yeah, they're just, they're doing their thing. They're doing it their way. And here we have the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And they go through, let me see, what did I want to show you? Yeah, I think it was just because they show all the people with conflicts of interest. Here's your summary of disclosures, right? So these are the people we already saw, just in more detail. It gives time frames for their conflicts of interest. And yeah, I mean, check it out. See for yourself. We're going to pick up the pace here because we have a lot to go through. I also want to mention, I have mentioned this in the past, but it's worth repeating. What the dietary, what the food-based dietary guidelines, what they're doing is playing manipulative word games so that they can push their agenda while not sounding the alarm to the average person or to the average scientist. They're trying to manipulate you by going from what they just said on the official, realfood.gov website, real food, right? Whole foods, real food. And yet when it comes to, downplaying certain things that, that are not as good, they're going to change it from whole foods and real foods, food that we all recognize. People don't eat ingredients. People don't eat nutrients. People eat food, right? Obviously, there's supplements and that exists, but people eat food for nutrition. So when something is positive, they're like, oh yeah, eat more of this. When there's negative findings and they, instead of encouraging you to eat less of those foods, they historically say, eat less saturated fat. Instead of saying, drink less dairy, they'll say, drink low fat dairy. It's like, they'll play these word games, right? Lean meats. So rather than just coming out and admitting all of this, they're going to try to manipulate you as best they can. It's also worth mentioning, Dr. Oz, who was like such a dweeb and a dork, a few years ago. And then as soon as he somehow sycophantically attached to the Trump administration, to RFK's, HHS, all of a sudden conservatives are like accepting of the guy. They're like cheerleading for the guy. And I'm like, I remember 10 years ago, nobody liked the guy, and here we have a report from 2014 published in BMJ, televised medical talk shows, what they recommend and the evidence to support their recommendations, a prospective observational study. And if we just scroll down and look at some of the results, what they did is they looked at the doctors and they looked at Dr. Oz show. Okay, for recommendations in the Dr. Oz show, can you guys see this? Let me enlarge it a little bit. For recommendations in the Dr. Oz show, Evidence supported 46%, contradicted 15%, and was not found for 39%. Believable or somewhat believable evidence supported 33% of the recommendations on the Dr. Oz show. On average, the Dr. Oz show had 12 recommendations per episode. The most common recommendation category was dietary advice, 39%. And the magnitude of benefit was described for 17% of the recommendations on the Dr. Oz show. And so, Dr. Oz has a history of just peddling sensational claims to nationally televised audiences for, the equivalent of clickbait, the equivalent of, engagement with his show. So let's look at some evidence now, some very solid evidence that may call into question some of the things that are now part of the new dietary guidelines. This is from Circulation, and it says Dietary Fats in Cardiovascular Disease, a presidential advisory from the American Heart Association. Okay. So let's see. In summary, randomized control trials that lowered intake of dietary saturated fat and replaced it with polyunsaturated vegetable oil reduced cardiovascular disease by about 30%, similar to the reduction achieved by statin treatment. Prospective observational studies in many populations showed that lower intake of saturated fat, coupled with higher intake of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated plant-based fat, is associated with lower rates of cardiovascular disease and of other major causes of death and all-cause mortality. In contrast, replacement of saturated fat with mostly refined carbohydrates and sugars is not associated with lower rates of cardiovascular disease and did not reduce cardiovascular disease in clinical trials. So it's specifically plant-based fats are healthier. Replacement of saturated with unsaturated fats lowers LDL cholesterol, a cause of atherosclerosis, linking biological evidence with incidence of cardiovascular disease in populations and in clinical trials. Taking into consideration the totality of scientific evidence satisfying rigorous criteria for causality, we conclude strongly that lowering intake of saturated fat and replacing it with unsaturated fat, especially polyunsaturated fat like walnuts, will lower the incidence of cardiovascular disease. This recommended shift from saturated to unsaturated fats should occur simultaneously in overall healthy dietary patterns such as DASH. Okay. Just to drive the point home even further, this is a Newsweek article, experts behind the new food pyramid. It's not a pyramid technically. Have ties to beef and dairy industries. Yeah. It's just the way they're packaging it, the way they're branding it. It sounds so revolutionary. It sounds so refreshing. Like, finally, we're going to do things differently, Yeah. The NIH, Office of Nutrition Research, coordinated an external peer review process, assigning 2 independent reviewers to each scientific review. Reviewers were selected based on relevant experience and absence of conflicts of interest. Of course, this is the opposite of RFK Jr.'s advisory panel. So, yeah. We have here association between whole grain intake and all-cause mortality, a meta-analysis of cohort studies. So remember, here we go. What's down here at the bottom? According to RFK Jr. and Brooke Rollins, whole grains, real food from nature, whole grains are the worst thing that you could possibly put in your body. And here we're looking at a meta-analysis of these cohort studies. Let's just... I don't know why I had specific things highlighted in these tabs before I went live. And then now that I pull it up, all of my highlighted stuff is gone, even though I tested it before. In conclusion, the present meta-analysis indicates that an increased whole grain intake is associated with a reduced risk of all-cause mortality. These findings add to and extend the evidence that an increased dietary whole grain intake may exert healthy effects and decrease the risk of all-cause mortality, and support current recommendations to increase whole grain consumption to promote health and longevity. And I think it's worthwhile to mention the Hispanic paradox. So in America, Hispanics are lower socioeconomic status on average, and there's a paradox that exists where socioeconomic status can be a risk factor for, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, atherosclerosis, all-cause mortality, right? And wouldn't you know it, Hispanics in America, living in America, actually have lower rates compared to, white Americans. And so people go, okay, well, why is that? And they look into it, and they find that the Hispanic paradox is actually due to the fact that despite having less money, despite being lower on the socioeconomic, ladder, they're consuming more rice and beans, which is to say more legumes, more whole grains. Extremely protective foods. I mean, does anyone actually believe, obviously there are some people out there, and I'm not trying to sound, insulting or patronizing or anything, but is there anyone out there who actually believes nuts, rice and beans, whole grains, bananas and grapes are unhealthy and should be avoided, should be limited? What, dude? What clown world? Honk, honk. It's bizarre. It's extremely bizarre and disheartening. It's sad to see this. All right. Dietary carbohydrate intake and mortality, a prospective cohort study and meta-analysis published in The Lancet in September 2018 by Siedelman et al. And so this is particularly examining the sort of low carb, ketogenic statements made by RFK Jr. Funding, National Institutes of Health, right? As we talked about in the beginning, government-funded and foundation-funded nutrition research is the most reliable, generally speaking. They're going to be the most scrupulous with, conflicts of interest and study design. All right. Both high and low percentages of carbohydrate diets were associated with increased mortality, with minimum risk observed at 50 to 55% carbohydrate intake. 50 to 55% carbohydrate intake. This does not look like 50 to 55% carbohydrate intake. Obviously, there's some carbs up here, but, whole grains are going to make up the majority of most people's, carbohydrate intake. Low carbohydrate diet patterns favoring animal-derived protein and fat sources from sources such as lamb, beef, pork, and chicken were associated with higher mortality. whereas those that favored plant-derived protein and fat intake from sources such as vegetables, nuts, peanut butter, whole grain breads were associated with lower mortality, suggesting that the source of food notably modifies the association between carbohydrate intake and mortality. If you want any more evidence, if you are still on the fence, watch my recent discussion called Stop Obsessing About Protein. We have a fear of carbohydrates. We have an infatuation with protein. Everyone thinks that protein is safe because carbs and fats are scary, and there is a herd mentality, a groupthink that's happening, a mass formation psychosis, if you will, probably due in large part to the food industry, that protein should be your number one target. And just to drive the point home, this is a Harvard study, low carbohydrate diets and all-cause and cause-specific mortality, 2 cohort studies, published in 2010 by Fung et al. So a low carbohydrate, let me enlarge that for you. A low carbohydrate diet based on animal sources was associated with higher all-cause mortality in both men and women, whereas a vegetable-based low-carbohydrate diet was associated with lower all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality rates. So the pronouncements made from RFK Jr. and Brooke Rollins are not in alignment with the majority of consensus nutrition research at present. You have this article from 2020. This came out after the previous dietary guidelines, right? So keep in mind, they come out every 5 years. So 2020, well, it was like end of 2019, but basically 2020, 2025. And people were raising the alarm. They're like, eat less, red meat. So critics pointed out numerous flaws with the Annals publications. So just to give you context, there was a frenzy with let's just go from here. The guidelines set off a frenzy with dramatic headlines suggesting that conventional nutrition wisdom had been overturned. This response produced a counter-reaction with various experts and public health organizations slamming the guidelines. Walter Willett, a Harvard professor, that's my boy Walter. We went over him in the last one, How to Find Truthful Nutrition Information. He's the second most cited nutrition scientist of all time, 31,000 citations. Called them the most egregious abuse of data I've ever seen. Okay. Critics pointed out numerous flaws with the Annals publications. Most conspicuously, the authors had used a review methodology that valorizes randomized clinical trials, but it is famously difficult to do RCTs for nutrition, right? There are limitations on funding, limitations in terms of the availability of the cohort, ethical limitations, so on and so forth. It's very difficult and very expensive to do a long-term RCT or even a short-term RCT. So by choosing this particular assessment tool, the investigators excluded most of the benchmark studies on red meat and health, and we soon learned that some of them had undisclosed ties to the food industry. In particular, the lead author was senior author on a similar study in 2016 that challenged the advice to eat less sugar. That paper, which also appeared in the Annals of Internal Medicine, was paid for by the International Life Sciences Institute, ILSI, ILSI. Bookmark that in your brain. We are going to come back to it. It's a duplicitous front group for the food industry. Remember this line here. So ILSI is an industry group founded by a Coca-Cola executive and notorious for its repeated attempts to challenge international health guidelines. More to the point, the red meat is fine message flies in the face of a large and well-established body of evidence from epidemiological cohort studies, randomized trials with established risk factors as outcomes, and animal studies. We've gone through this in our Humans Are Not Carnivores episode. We talk about the convergence of the 4 pillars of nutritional science, which is to say, clinical, preclinical, epidemiological, and Mendelian randomization. People and lab animals whose diets are high in red and processed meats are more likely to suffer and die from type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, respiratory ailments, neurodegenerative diseases, and cancer than those whose diets are less meat-laden. One study of tens of thousands of men and women followed for an average of 26 years showed that every extra daily serving of red meat was associated with a 13% higher risk of death from all causes. Eating processed red meat increased that number to 20%. Given what the literature has shown about meat, more than a dozen experts asked the annals to retract the papers. Some suggested they should never have been published in the first place. And here we have the National Cancer Institute. So what you need to know here is that based on the preponderance of evidence, you can categorize carcinogens as known carcinogens, probable carcinogens, potential carcinogens, depending on the quality and quantity of evidence, right? So group 1 carcinogens are those for which we have the most evidence to say beyond the shadow of a doubt, absolutely carcinogenic. Group 1 does not mean most potent. That's a misconception. It means most evidence, not most potent. So Dr. Greger makes the joke that, plutonium and pastrami are both group 1 carcinogens, but they're not. I'd rather have a pastrami sandwich than a plutonium sandwich. So processed meat, sausage, right? Salami, pastrami, like all that sort of stuff. Processed meat is associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer, and evidence also suggests it is associated with stomach cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies processed meat as a group 1 carcinogen, meaning it's carcinogenic to humans, and red meat as a group 2 carcinogen, meaning it's probably carcinogenic to humans. And of course, that aligns very much with the WHO. And here we have, look at this. At the top of their inverted pyramid, we have processed meat, red meat. So we have group 1 carcinogen, group 2 carcinogen. All of these are going to be high in heme iron, methionine, as we talked about, heavy metal concentrations, saturated fat, dietary cholesterol, trans fat, parasites to a degree. So yeah. All right. What I want to do now is we're going to shift. We're going to start talking about some of the techniques, strategies of the food industry. And we're going to use a case example. We're going to look at the beef checkoff, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And what you need to be aware of, look, we understand that this happens with politics. It happens pretty much with everything, is that there are influencer programs now. They even admit it and brag about it on their website. Influencer partnerships also play a key role. Culinary experts such as chefs Brooke Williamson and Tim Hollingsworth, pitmaster Erica Roby, and butcher T.C. Turner bring beef recipes and cooking expertise to their own audiences. Registered dietitians like Amy Goodson and Stephanie Militano share science-based nutrition information. When those creators develop beef recipes or educational content, it lives on beef. It's what's for dinner. That's their PR campaign. Their followers are introduced to the brand and directed back to the site. So it's this cross collaboration that they have as a partnership with influencers or misinfluencers. This article you got to read. It's on The Guardian. Inside Big Beef's climate messaging machine, confuse, defend, and downplay. This is not the greenhouse gas emission thing. I could not care less about. What I'm interested in is their war room strategies. Check this out. A digital command center staffed 24/7. A 5-year strategy document written in 2020 by a handful of leading cattle industry organizations identified a need to turn up the heat in its messaging fight. Their highest priority was to demonstrate beef's positive sustainability message and key role in regenerative agriculture. Okay, so the Cattlemen's Beef Board, which contracts with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association for its marketing and promotion efforts, has long had significant cultural impact. All right, hang on. Where do I want to go? This is the part. In a private video training session for beef industry influencers, Sarah Reese, NCBA's Senior Executive Director of Brand Marketing, described a plan that involved paid advertising on Google, Facebook, Reddit, YouTube, and Instagram, as well as video and audio ad spots on ESPN, Spotify, and Sirius XM Radio. One sustainability-oriented marketing effort, which ran from April to June 2021, generated 60 million impressions. Okay. Those efforts appear to be going strong in 2023. According to strategy documents posted to the Beef Board's website, NCBA requested $9.1 million for content marketing and paid advertising this year, all of which serve to improve beef's image and some of which specifically communicate the net climate and environmental impact of beef production. Then there is the Master of Beef Advocacy program, though the NCBA has even more ambitious plans to combat what it calls misinformation. Using checkoff money, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association has developed what it calls a digital command center, a sophisticated online monitoring system that tracks media outlets and social media for more than 200 beef-related topics. Hosted in Denver in a space that, quote, looks like a military operations center combined with a TV section at an electronics retailer, according to a recent Cattlemen's Beef Board mailer sent to ranchers, the command center alerts members of NCBA's issues, management, and media relations team whenever stories or online chatter rise above a certain threshold. It's staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with personnel redundancies built in to make sure someone's always watching. One goal is to enable the industry to respond to emerging public health or economic emergencies, but the center, which received $750,000 in checkoff money for fiscal year 2023, is also used to keep track of public conversations around beef's sustainability in real time and to deploy, quote, talking points, media statements, fact sheets, infographics, videos, and various digital assets as necessary to shift the terms of the conversation. Creepy. Very creepy. All right. Yeah, that's about Nina Teicholz. We'll come back to that. Do you remember when we were, where was it? Here. This was on the, we were talking about the International Life Sciences Institute. Okay, so we're going to talk now about front groups which operate as ostensible consumer advocacy watchdog groups that are there for to protect your interest as a consumer. And just like the Patriot Act, they come up with very clever names to hide their evil deeds, to hide their true agenda. And so ILSI, the International Life Sciences Institute, is a front group that provides funders with global lobbying services while masquerading as science. It's one of the main, probably the number one front group that Marion Nestle calls out in her book, Unsavory Truth. Let's see. I have it somewhere. International Life Sciences Institute is a food industry lobby group. Yeah, I mean, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Oh, sorry, guys. So sorry. I thought you were looking at the article with me. My mistake. So a picture's worth 1,000 words here. You can just see ILSI is going to bat for these awesome companies. Unilever, Cargill, DuPont, Coca-Cola, Bayer, Monsanto, PepsiCo, Dow, McDonald's. Yeah. Does that sound to you like, they're looking out for you? Yeah, there are a number of emails that have been leaked by the U.S. Right to Know that are pretty damning. ILSI undermined obesity prevention efforts in China. It's all about money, baby. ILSI sugar study out of tobacco industry's playbook. That's like we talked about. Yep, there's Marion Nestle. Tobacco companies use ILSI to thwart policy. ILSI leaders helped defend glyphosate. ILSI's cozy ties at the CDC. Their influence on dietary guidelines, their influence in India. I mean, author of Meat Studies failed to disclose ILSI ties. It just goes on and on. It just goes on and on. And there's another example. You should know about this guy. You can't see his face because it's behind my face. Rick Berman. This guy. Look at that crap-eating grin. All right, who is this guy? Come on, go back. Go back. There we go. Former labor management attorney. Okay. The point is, this guy has, he set up this organization that he called the Center for Consumer Freedom. They renamed to the Center for Organizational Research and Education. He has earned the nickname Dr. Evil. He has worked with the tobacco industry, McDonald's and other fast food, the alcohol industry, Monsanto, and there are recordings of him that you can find on the internet where he thought he was speaking privately, but he was being recorded. He was bragging about how good he is at setting up front groups for over 20 years. He's basically a mercenary for hire. He creates these fake grassroots movements, astroturfing movements. And the guy, he brags in this secretly recorded audio about how he's so good at laundering money, essentially, at keeping everything anonymous and making sure that you'll never be exposed if you work with him. This is the guy who was hired by the bacon industry to promote bacon and to downplay plant-based bacons, plant-based meats. And this is his website, consumerfreedom.com. And they just, when you look into it, the claims that they make, they sound good on the surface. And then it's actually total hogwash, pun intended, I suppose. They make the argument that if you can't pronounce it, you shouldn't eat it, which is not true. There are so many vitamins that have long names. There are so many innocuous ingredients that have long names. The average person is not a chemist. The average person is not a nutritionist. The average person has no idea, I could come up with so many examples of, docosahexaenoic acid. Oh my God, don't eat that. Oh, it's just DHA. It's actually very healthy. Cocalciferol. Oh no, vitamin D3. Don't just suddenly write something off simply because you cannot pronounce it. Methylcobalamin. Oh wait, that's just B12. So they ran this long campaign basically trying to prey on your fear and gin up fear around healthy and even just normal ingredients in some of the plant-based meats that were out there. I don't know how much time we're going to have to get into all this stuff. Okay. Oh gosh, this is going to be a long one here. All right, I'm going to try to speed this up, guys. Then there's one more person we might as well mention while we're on the subject. Let's go through two more examples real quick. Nina Teicholz, she's one of the primary lobbyists and science communicators for the meat industry. She never discloses her conflicts of interest. She authored a book, The Big Fat Surprise or something like that, and it was panned by Red Pen Reviews, which we went over in the resources bit for the How to Find Truthful Nutrition Information talk we did a couple weeks ago. We talked about Red Pen Reviews. Seth Yoder, totally. Not only did he say, I'm shocked at how bad the book is and how bad the science is and how bad the writing is. He's like, she just plagiarizes. She lifts other people's work without even giving credit. And she is funded by a billionaire. What's his name? John Arnold. And so she's the organizer of a fledgling group that is engaged in a vigorous advocacy campaign to reshape how the U.S. government determines what makes a healthy diet. The effort is being bankrolled by billionaire Houston philanthropists John and Laura Arnold, who also underwrote her article in the BMJ. She's another source of just terrible disinformation. This is an unearthed investigation, and there's this guy, Frank Mitloehner. He's a UC Davis professor, I believe. Says, but now a major new unearthed investigation has revealed that the center's links to the meat and dairy industries are much deeper and more ingrained than previously known. More than 100 pages of correspondence between the Clear Center and its agribusiness supporters, obtained by Unearthed under Freedom of Information laws, reveal how the center's structure was agreed through a memorandum of understanding between UC Davis and an offshoot of the American Feed Industry Association, a trade body whose members include some of the world's biggest livestock and feed producers. The documents show how, under the terms set out in this agreement, industry groups have committed millions of dollars of funding for Clear's work, and the center has committed to maintaining an advisory board of 12 of its agribusiness funders to provide input and advice on the research and communication priorities of the industry. And so there's just so much money pouring into shaping public policy and public perceptions from particularly the animal agribusiness. And it's truly, truly astonishing. Now, what I want to do here friendly. And so it's just important to understand when we combine that with what we saw earlier from The Guardian, that they have the 24/7 digital command center that is the panopticon, listening to all conversations, scanning, the entire internet for 200 beef-related topics, and then jumping in to steer the conversation with premeditated talking points and infographics and industry-funded, National Cattlemen Beef Association funded propaganda and science. And then, just combining that with combining that with what we saw regarding the National Cattlemen Beef Association admitting that they pay the influencers and that they have this relationship with, I call them misinfluencers. So it's crazy how much misinformation is out there, and we really just don't even have a full grasp on how bad it is. All right, I should just really skip a lot of this stuff. But let me just say, regarding some of these industry shills, if they're attempting to discredit epidemiology or attack the legends of nutrition science, the titans of nutrition science, you should immediately just assume you're being manipulated. Go back and check out the episode I did called Humans Are Not Carnivores, where we really get into the rationale for why epidemiology is sound science. It's one of the most incredible nutritional science tools that we have, and it has been behind the discovery and proof for so many different public health crises, the toxins and the risk factors that we all agree on. And when it comes to meat, it just so happens that everyone suddenly rejects epidemiology and they want to throw it out. And that's because epidemiology is a fantastic tool set at identifying and inferring causal or contributing factors for long-term chronic disease formation, where short-term clinical trials are incapable of determining that. They just look at changes in biomarkers in the short term. And so real quick, we're going to sprint through this next bit here, and we're going to talk about some of the budgets for big agriculture. Again, thinking back to the USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins, who that's her allegiance, that's her background, that's her loyalty, is to supporting and promoting and advocating on behalf of big ag. So these are particularly organizations that lobby. And so you have the National Pork Producers Council, which has an annual budget of $2 to $4 million. The U.S. Dairy Export Council and National Milk Producers Federation combined have $50 million annually. North American Meat Institute, $1.5 to $3 million annually. National Cattlemen's Beef Association, $6 to $10 million annually. National Chicken Council, $4 to $5 million annually. National Turkey Federation, $5 to $10 million annually. American Egg Producers, $1 to $2 million annually. As far as organizations that do not lobby, you have the American Egg Board, $25 to $30 million annually. USA Poultry and Egg Export Council, $17 to $18 million annually. U.S. Meat Export Federation, $50 to $51 million annually. Animal Agricultural Alliance, $1.15 million annually. And those are really more engaged in the funding of science and advocacy and science communication, et cetera, not lobbying per se. And those are just some of the big ones. I am just pulling some of the largest to prove a point. There are so many more beyond these, but the total industry promotion, research, and lobbying expenditure, particularly from the checkoffs, the federations, the councils, the associations for animal products, exceeds $600 million, potentially exceeding $1 billion annually when including all partners, exports, state efforts. Dairy and beef dominate, of course. And so this is worth mentioning, especially where we're going with this conversation, but it's worth mentioning because when you think about food industry influence and big agriculture influence in nutrition and shaping federal policy and public policy, that is a crap load of money. And again, I talk to people all the time who are like, I just want money out of it. I want money out of the equation. Regardless of what they eat, regardless of what their dietary preferences are, they just want money out. And you're talking about almost $1 billion, potentially more, annually from, the animal product industry. So why bring that up? Aside from the lobbying efforts, big agriculture's massive mandatory checkoff programs. This is since 1996. Ag producers in the U.S. have been legally required to participate, meaning to fund, these federal checkoff programs since the enactment of the Commodity Promotion, Research, and Information Act. In the beef industry, for example, the mandatory contribution is $1 per animal sold at slaughter. And so, you've got beef, which is the Cattlemen's Beef Promotion and Research Board, the Cattlemen's Beef Board. Pork, the National Pork Board. You have the National Dairy Promotion and Research Board. You have the American Egg Board, the National Honey Board, the American Lamb Board. All of these are combined another $500 million to $800 million annually. And then what does that mean for subsidies, right? So if that's the money that they're taking in from big ag and then redistributing it through a lot of lobbying efforts, but also just, shaping public policy, public opinion, etc. Well, it results in huge subsidies, huge kickbacks from the government. So if we're going to talk about subsidies, the total direct USDA subsidies to livestock and seafood producers from 1995 to 2023 was at least $72 billion. About $2.5 billion a year on average. And that's across the board. So that includes, things like disaster relief and livestock commodity purchases and any type of subsidy. So recent livestock feeding operations, 2018 to 2023, top 10,000 operations received $12.1 billion total, $2 billion a year average. Beef, cattle, dairy, and hogs received the most. And then annual direct government payments context. So total farm payments, often $10 billion to $40 billion in recent years. Livestock share is a large portion. Dairy margarine coverage alone has ranged from 37 million to 1.3 billion in 2023. Then there's livestock insurance subsidies, which is another 419 million in 2023. We're talking huge numbers. So dairy gets the most, beef and cattle, pork and hogs, poultry and eggs, and then lamb, honey, smaller associations like that. And then if you think about indirect subsidies, this is a part that no one ever talks about, but we're going to talk about it. So yes, there are crop producers that get subsidies, but guess where the lion's share goes to? Corn and soybeans. And 90% of that is fed right back into livestock. So it's 90% indirectly going right back to these producers, the animal agricultural industry. There is a finger on the scale that is so large, so powerful, and so pervasive. It's truly hard to wrap your head around. Estimates of total effective support to animal agriculture, including the feed, is often cited at $30 billion to $38 billion a year. Although, it depends on who you ask and how you calculate. But think about that. Subsidies, keeping these industries going out of tax dollars. I don't want my money going there, but I don't have a say in the matter. I'm going to have to skip a lot of this, man. We gotta get going here. All right. Let's skip forward here. We're going to go now towards the last section, and then we'll get to questions. So we're going to talk now about resources, and I'm going to give you guys information that I think will empower you. I would first say that in the way of books, as I mentioned earlier, Marion Nestle is truly the world's foremost authority on, well, maybe not the world, but certainly in the Western world, the foremost authority on what she calls food politics. And that's the name of her book, Food Politics, How the Food Industry Influences Nutrition and Health. I listened to the audiobook. I don't have a physical copy to show you here. Same thing with her other book, Unsavory Truth, How Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat. Highly recommend those two first. She has about 17 books in total. She is quite prolific, but start with Food Politics and Unsavory Truth. I think those are her two best books. Then there's Michael Moss, who wrote Hooked, Food, Free Will, and How the Food Giants Exploit Our Addictions. And David Michaels, who wrote The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money, and the Science of Deception. I think those are incredible books that will go infinitely farther than I did here in today's conversation. We only scratched the surface, even though I've been ranting now for almost 2 hours. And I would say, as far as websites go, I would recommend Marion Nestle's foodpolitics.com. She has one of, if not the largest watchdog group for industry-funded research, identifying and exposing conflicts of interest. And you can find all of her other resources here. And then I would also recommend the University of California, San Francisco's website, industrydocuments.ucsf.edu/food. And this is where you're going to find, just, it's like a free searchable tool to, they've got, millions of internal food industry memos and emails and strategies and litigation and investigations and so much more. And so that's a good one to get you going. And I would say be on the lookout for, when you're reading a study, just scroll down and check out the sponsors, the acknowledgments, the conflicts of interest. That does not necessarily mean you should discard the study if you identify a conflict of interest, but it should be a yellow traffic light. It should be a yield, proceed with caution sign. There can be good things that come out of food industry funded research, which I know you're probably laughing because it's like I just devoted a whole episode to talking about it, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. All right. I've never seen the chat explode like this. Wow. Okay, so most of this is from one dude. Yeah. Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to, I should have been pausing throughout. Now I'm just trying to catch up in the chat. Give me just 1 second here to catch up. There's so much being said. Look, I mean, I did show a lot of the studies, so, go read through them on your own time. I would encourage you to check out some of the studies that I cited. They're powerful. And look, this is scratching the surface. Everything we talked about, this is, it's impossible to cover every angle of this subject in one conversation, even if it's hours long. Volumes have been written on this subject. So, of course, I'm not going to get to every little nuance, and I hear a lot of the points you guys are bringing up. They're good points, and I agree with a lot of it. I always appreciate spirited debate and pushback, and I think as long as we're all engaging in good faith, it's healthy. And so I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. Let me also check. I always forget to check some of the other platforms, like we're on X and BitChute, and I always just check Rumble, and I don't want anyone else to think like I'm ignoring you guys. It's just that usually there aren't many comments, or sometimes no comments on some of the other platforms. It seems like Rumble is the main source, the bomb diggity. Yeah, I mean, nobody's commenting on X. I appreciate you guys tuning in for this subject. It's a contentious subject, and by no means is like the conversation settled on any of this. I think at the very beginning of the conversation, I made a strong point saying that we need more research to identify the spread and scope of research that is industry funded. I intentionally lumped in big agriculture into today's conversation because I feel like that's often left out of the conversation. People generally approach this only from the angle of food companies per se, corporations per se, but the revolving door between big ag and government, the unhealthy relationship with, how they influence Brooke Rollins, the USDA secretary, RFK Jr., the HHS secretary. You can't talk about this subject without bringing up big ag, in my opinion, because what we're seeing now with the inversion of the dietary guidelines pyramid, the food pyramid, and the repudiation of decades of consensus science is, I don't want to say criminal, but it's egregious. It's insane. And you even have RFK Jr. talking trash about the USDA, about the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. These are some of the most respected scientists in the field of nutrition in the English-speaking world. And for him to just talk trash about them and say, oh, they've all got conflicts of interest, and then to literally subvert the national, established protocol and convene his own dietary advisory council that has 8 out of 9 people that have conflicts of interest. It's clown world for sure. And so, as someone who has eaten a plant-based diet for 18 years and I get my blood work done and I don't take supplements, and I I get fortified foods that have 1 or 2 supplements here and there, but I get all of my nutrition from food. And then I see, people get very irate, and they're like, if you're going to call out the animal product industry in terms of its undue effect, its outsized effect on dietary guidelines, bring the proof. And I'm like, here you go. Here's 2 hours of food for thought. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you so much for tuning in. I want to especially thank everybody who's a paying member at Dauntless. You guys are incredible. And if y'all can just smash the like button, share this show with your friends, consider becoming a member at Dauntless. We are putting out, and we're developing a number of projects right now, and we're putting out some incredible content in the next month or two. So stay tuned. Thank you guys for supporting us. If you're a Gold Pass member, check your email. We're trying to set up a private call where you can engage with me, and then in the future engage with other members of the Dauntless team. That's going to be fun, and there'll be more perks for gold members as we move forward. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in. You guys are amazing. I love you all so much, and it's such an honor to be here with you guys talking about my favorite subject. And we'll catch you guys in the next one. Until then, stay healthy.